I have nothing to work on anymore. I actually graduated a book, and I read the entire thing. And 3 of the questions could not be answered. It's something first I find episode sources where nothing on it. I basically worked on a one-line answer there, one-line answer there, one-line answer there, put together. I had my high hopes. And then when I go to the class, since I asked you to do 1 and 2, we'll have it before this class. Wasn't it 1 to 5? No, we had to 1 and 2. And then you will get 1 question. Because my thing is class. The teacher, you texted me in the center 2 weeks. So he knows every session is 5 questions. I need to make sure that's how you control that 205 years. So I was not stressing. I have nothing to work on anymore. I actually graduated a book, and I read the entire thing. And 3 of the questions could not be answered. It's something first I find episode sources where nothing on it. I basically worked on a one-line answer there, one-line answer there, one-line answer there, put together. I had my high hopes. And then when I go to the class, since I asked you to do 1 and 2, we'll have it before this class. Wasn't it 1 to 5? No, we had to 1 and 2. And then you will get 1 question.
I just want to, because a number of people have asked me the question, which is about this project and stuff like this. Remember, one of your assignments is working individually or in groups, develop a project that clarifies the political context of technology. And everyone's being thrown for a loop. So, everybody's being thrown by loop by the word project. I mean, that could just as easily develop an essay or write an essay. So a project just meant I was just trying to expand it a little slightly so that you can either write like a regular essay for the class, and I'd just like to talk to you what your topics are, and we'll all meet individually. Or if you want to go, or you might want to do an essay and do something else, you can also develop a project, which just means, like last year, a number of students in the class wanted to do just really multimedia projects or sound projects, and then they had a writing component to them as well. So since it's a class on media, technology, and politics, I thought that it would be sort of useful if you want to work in the context of the media, then that's really to be encouraged and stuff, okay? The only thing that I would ask, is it okay? I'm worried about this. The only thing that I would, so in the next, if you could think about your essay or your project over like the next week or 2 weeks, because these things are really useful to get started on as early as possible, so that as you're doing a form of writing, as the class itself is going on, it makes for a much better class, and because you get into the readings deeper and stuff like this. Yeah.
If we do a multimedia component, it does decrease the amount of written we have to do, right?
Yes, it does. But I really, I'm sort of like a slave of writing. I'm a slave function. I know it's a terrible thing, but I really would like you to do a writing component as well. It's not the same.
It's not the same length.
No, no.
12 pages for the standards.
Yeah, yeah.
We have like a half and half. Like, could we do it 6 pages like multimedia and the rest?
Sure, sure. But maybe come in and talk to me beforehand, okay? Because the whole point of writing itself is they have like a reflection on the project itself. And the writing and the reflection you do would probably be on the project and what your methodology of what you're doing, or just a reflection on what's happening with it and stuff. It's like a media theory. Okay? Yeah. I really encourage you, if you feel comfortable, and you got like a new media project in mind, because I know a lot of people come to this class either from some arts backgrounds or music backgrounds, I just want to, because a number of people have asked me the question, which is about this project and stuff like this. Remember, one of your assignments is working individually or in groups, develop a project that clarifies the political context of technology. And everyone's being thrown for a loop. Everybody's being thrown by loop by the word project. I mean, that could just as easily develop an essay or write an essay. So a project just meant I was just trying to expand it a little slightly so that you can either write like a regular essay for the class, and I'd just like to talk to you what your topics are, and we'll all meet individually. Or if you want to go, or you might want to do an essay and do something else, you can also develop a project, which just means, like last year, a number of students in the class wanted to do, just really multimedia projects or sound projects, and then they had a writing component to them as well. So since it's a class on media, technology, and politics, I thought that it would be sort of useful if you want to work in the context of the media, then that's really to be encouraged and stuff, okay? The only thing that I would ask, is it okay? I'm worried about this. The only thing that I would, so in the next, if you could think about your essay or your project over like the next week or 2 weeks, because these things are really useful to get started on as early as possible, so that as you're doing a form of writing, as the class itself is going on, it makes for a much better class, and because you get into the readings deeper and stuff like this. Yeah.
If we do a multimedia component, it does decrease the amount of written we have to do, right?
Yes, it does. But I'm sort of like a slave of writing. I'm a slave function. I know it's a terrible thing, but I really would like you to do a writing component as well. It's not the same.
It's not the same length.
No, no.
12 pages for the standards.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
have like a half and half. Like, could we do it 6 pages like multimedia and the rest is?
Sure. But maybe come in and talk to me beforehand, okay? Because the whole point of writing itself is they have like a reflection on the project itself. And the writing and the reflection you do would probably be on the project and what your methodology of what you're doing, or just a reflection on what's happening with it and stuff. It's like a media theory, okay? Yeah, I really encourage you, if you feel comfortable, and you got like a new media project in mind, because I know a lot of people come to this class either from some arts backgrounds or music backgrounds, communications, poli-sci backgrounds, and really interested like in propaganda and like a whole variety of surveillance. Well, I mean, why not use a course like this creatively just to do something interesting? But at the same time, if you don't want to do that, I don't want to feel that that's anything wrong with that, because that's what I write all the time. And writing an essay is, like someone pointed out last week, is the most virtual thing that you can do and stuff like this. So they're both really fine. Just to say that the kind of horizon within which you can operate should just be creative and just think about what you want to do and stuff like this. Fair enough? Okay, so that's what I wanted to. Are there any questions on that? Okay. So the two things I want to focus on tonight, and I'll get to them in a minute. I just want to show a couple of web projects first of all. The part of the syllabus that we're at right now, just so we're sort of on the same thing, is we're talking about this sort of creepy thing called data flash, okay? And the way that we're going to discuss it is the basis of the book is, part 1 in the Cybercultures reader, which has in the syllabus is listed as 4 or 5 different readings, including starting with Michael Benedict's First Steps, then Arturo Escobar's Welcome to Siberia, Kevin Robbins, and whatnot. And what I'd like to do tonight is really focus on 2 of those readings, because they're really 2 specific perspectives in opposition to one another, which is start with Michael Benedict's Cyberspace First Steps, and then in the second part of the class talk about Arturo Escobar's Welcome to Siberia, Notes on the Anthropology of Cyberculture. Because they're really, if you read the articles, they're really different articles, because Michael Benedict has a utopian, messianic, and mesmerizing vision of technology, and Escobar writes from an anthropological perspective and says, hey, don't give me that talk about electrospheres, or Teilhard de Chardin talk about noospheres. Let's talk about the actual social and political grounding of technology. Let's talk about things like class structure and ideology and the relations of technology as technology itself gets really embedded in society. And then let's even go one step further in that and talk about what he calls, right at the end of his article, he calls technosociality. Because he says that technology has actually come inside us and begun to really create our identities. And he says, and sometimes even the language of biology comes inside us in terms of genetic engineering and creates what he calls biosociality. So these 2 articles, the the Michael Benedict article on Welcome to Cyberspace is, for myself, is like this kind of beautiful and elegiac immersion in the dream, utopian dream of cyberspace. And Escobar's perspective, written from a political and anthropological perspective, is really the opposite of that, because it really wants to debunk the myth, but to say something equally serious. Now, before we start that, I just want to show two things. I thought, well, this is an article, this is going to be a class on these two really different perspectives on cyberculture. One, the immersive McLuhanite, Teilhard de Chardin, Nicholas Negroponte perspective on cyberculture, which is to say that, as Michael Benedict's going to say, that what happens in electronic culture is it doesn't stay outside of us. It actually goes inside our imaginations and our minds and touches something which he calls deeply reptilian in our minds. It touches a very ancient part of our thinking and releases kind of a form of human identity that's been suppressed for eons. And Escobar is going to say, well, that's not really true. What we're really talking about when we talk about the question of ideology, technology, is we're talking about questions of ideology and questions of power. For example, it's very difficult to avoid, irrespective, I think, of your political perspective, the kind of general propaganda machine that's running these days that tells one story. It's like the French theorist Jean Baudrillard says, that the elites, are allowed to speak, and they're really the only ones allowed to speak, and we're allowed sort of to listen, and things wash over us. And I sort of kept that in mind as I've been watching, the preparations of what another French theorist, Paul Virilio, would say is the war machine, to get a war going on Iraq and stuff like this. And I just noticed last night that President Bush looked really confident. I said, this guy's really got good media training, because he came and he talked, and it's always to small groups, relatively small groups, but you can't see that with a camera. And I thought, like Ronald Reagan and the great orators, he's actually learned some very good techniques, like lean over the podium, relaxed, you don't have to speak loudly, the cameras will pick you up. And it's sort of like a gunslinger's pose in some ways. Says, well, if they came to pick a fight, they picked a good fight, they're going to get a fight from us. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Why is the guy so confident? And then I read today, I picked up the New York Times, and I said, okay, here are the polls. And the polls have 70% of Americans think that the United States should have a much tougher line in Iraq. 93% of Americans are quite willing to go to war if, in fact, the United Nations can't just negotiate, arms inspection, but in fact disarmament itself. And so I thought, well, this is a case later on in the semester of like this kind of media politics, like circular politics. Because the polls themselves aren't the beginning of anything, because polls are responses to questions that are asked. Like, how was that poll created? Who asked the question? And determining how you ask the question, you then have responses. And the responses then sweep right back into the political sphere, into the body politic. And the leaders, our creative, so-called creative leaders, then are sort of either abashed by the polls or find this kind of strength, because they're speaking for the strong consensus within the population, which then is fed back upon us as sort of like the passive subjects of a mediascape itself. So in the analysis of, I think, of power today, one really has to do media analysis. And then doing media analysis is probably necessary to go beyond things of, there are like controls that come from above and people are passive below, and really think in these kind of circular ways. Like, what is the relationship between the act of polling? Is polling itself an act of ideology? And what is the relationship to the act of polling, and who frames the questions, to the actions of political leaders, to the creation of public policy, to the creation of political agendas of very powerful societies like the United States? Now, the reason that I'm mentioning this is I just want to show two websites. We put a call in, we do with Cornell University, we do a project, a multimedia project called Theory Multimedia. And we just put out a call through like a whole global network of young artists saying we want to do something on digital terror and ethnic scapegoating. Really to have artistic reflections on what's going on post 9/11. And one of the responses to that, an interesting response, came from South Africa, from two South Africans, from a guy named Dror Eyal and Stacey Hardy. One, I think Dror Eyal was in Johannesburg and Stacey was in Cape Town. And I thought it was really interesting because the piece that first came to us, they sent us, say, well, you might want to read our email on this. And the email begins by saying, hey, what's going on and stuff like this. And did you see this call for things. It says this: hey, last time I watched the War on Terror on CNN, it made me so depressed that I stayed drunk for 3 days. I didn't go to work, had a horrible fight with my boyfriend over a stupid bottle of 10 milligram Calmets. I threw it in an ashtray, a pair of Nike trainers. I ended up the whole debacle, passing out stone cold. Well, I'm not going to read on. But not before dropping 16 Calmets and 3 vitamin B complexes. So I must have figured to wake up, or at least the autopsy would say my liver was okay. The TV doesn't work anymore, so I'm drinking Coke Light and listening to an old DJ Spooky album. You know, Songs of a Dead Dreamer, Postmodern Clash of Culture, McLuhan, non-hierarchical techniques of collage and bricolage that have been always present in African diasporic music, the absence and presence of sounds and the worldwide range of cultural reference points, etc., etc. And then response. Hi, wasn't it DJ Spooky who said, memory and temporal structure are the new space of art to me? Sheesh. I don't remember. I have very little memory. I can't remember most things from day to day. I keep falling like that guy in the film, Memento. I need new tattoos and all that. I have sort of faulty memory. Not too sure about the relationship between Spooky's autonomous zones and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. On his appointment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, well, wait, get this. The commission must do its work as quickly as possible so that we can close a horrendous chapter in the life of our nation. Close the chapter. When is that happens? When we close a book or a chapter, where are we? The readers, writers, and written of the past. When the book is closed, how do we get out of it to sit at the desk which supports it? Or am I missing something later? And then so you might just want to go up and just check this. I don't want to read the whole thing right now. Go up and check it out, because then just they pass sort of dialogue back and forth in email itself. They then begin to speak about memory and how memory, just like as we're going to speak about in this class, is not something that's just given, but in fact memory is something that is fabricated. Memory, in fact, is like prosthetic in a media culture, is almost sometimes like prosthetic implants. Like you think you remember something, I say, I clearly remember that. And then you sort of realize you got like a false media memory in some ways. And you say to yourself, well, do I really remember that? Or is that some image that I saw on television? Is that some bit of gossip or rumor that I heard on the net itself? Or is my memory of this sort of a musical memory? Has it been coded by a song that I was listening to, a song that I was downloading itself? And you ask yourself the question, you know, memory is something that I can rely on. It's sort of my own. Until you sort of think about media culture like EO and Stacey Hardy do and say, well, maybe our memories that we have are themselves fabricated. Maybe they themselves are circular. Maybe our memories begin to reflect the kind of looping and circulation of images and sound and image matrix within which we live. So these two young artists then began to think about that and said, well, maybe we need a new way of representing memory today. Maybe, in fact, every memory is like making a movie, like from Soweto. You join timelines together like this. And they want to say that memory may be, I'm probably not making a great movie by any chance, I don't think. But we'll give it a try. Maybe memory is like this, and maybe a kind of resistance is to make your own memories very conscious. Or from New York. Now we all know the official memory, and this, of course, you know, this website begins, web project begins as a response to the kind of deep depression they feel over watching CNN, like feeling the tragedy, but at the same time, through the days after, beginning to feel nauseous about the circular loop that's going on, the plane crashing into the building and the kind of seduction of the catastrophe for the media itself. So they begin to build their own memories. And then they begin to ask the question as this goes on, well, how in fact do in fact memories begin to loop? You're a black South African, you're in Soweto, you've just been liberated from apartheid and from, as they describe it, from the cruelest history of oppression that people have suffered. And suddenly your memories aren't of South Africa anymore. Suddenly your memories publicly are taken over by events that are happening in New York. And you don't have the CNN perspective on this because you say, well, what are our own kind of cataclysms and suffering in South Africa? Why does that not get represented in the same way itself? And what do you do when you're a silenced member of an audience? You're waking up, you're sort of depressed, you're watching the mediascape, and these two young artists, really respond. You really have to develop a new kind of media practice. And the idea for them of this media practice is really, instead of withdrawing from the question of what happens to our memory or what happens to our perception of events, why not in fact directly ask that question itself? Like a film Memento asks that question very directly. Media artists like this asks it very directly. Now I just wanted to, I wanted to mention this because this is so much like Escobar's perspective in some ways. Because Escobar says that the question of technology really is grounded in questions of gender and class and history and ideology. And you can't really talk about media, technology, and politics unless we talk about those really highly charged questions and see how they're changing. The other perspective, like Michael Benedict's, would be more similar to this. This is by Christina McPhee, and she's a really wonderful new media artist from Los Angeles. She did this piece called 47 Reds. Now just read the first line and then I'm going to go into a piece. She said, well, if I can read it. She says, the technology of the net-based self is imagined as cyborg. Her memory stretches and slips, sets and resets elastically through a neural-sensual landscape. Inside a world city whose eyes, ropes, nose, shifts and smashes are transpersonal portals of repression and desire. Many of these texts are taken from, do you know the writer Italo Calvino? His Invisible Cities, which is really a fabulous book. And just like Michael Benedict says that cyberculture is third world. It's a world of representations and you sort of slipstream through it and you swim through cyberspace itself. She's trying to describe a form of writing and of art that describes how you move through electronic culture. Okay. Close. I have to be a good little boy and close my little things here. Great. And I'm just going to turn. Okay, I think I know all the codes now. Okay, so I just wanted to show those because to show that the articles in the books themselves have like real representations and expressions of real creative forms of expression and actually young artists that are trying to deal with these questions itself. So when Michael Benedict talks about, cyberspace first steps, he could be talking about Christina McPhee in 47 Reds, who says, what does it mean to live in the electronic cities that Michael Benedict describes? What does it mean when you live in Montreal and you think you're living in a geographical city? But then when you study the political economy in Montreal, you say, well, no, Montreal is no longer just a geographically enclosed city. It's really a world city because it has streams of data and portals of data arrays that stream right outside Montreal that certainly go down to New York, go to Paris, slipstream through to, of the Pacific Rim countries. That, where is Montreal begin and end? Where does electronic, the electronic city of Montreal, which is so highly touted, where does that begin and end itself? And so if you live in Montreal and you experience the economy and the architecture of the city, doesn't that also mean that Montreal itself could be viewed as a city, as a portal into the world city, into Italo Calvino's like invisible city itself? And that's, the perspective of like Michael Benedict. And he's saying, well, what does that mean for our form of being a net-based self? What does it mean when we really, technologies are no longer outside of us, but they actually become invisible when they move from the physical realm to the psychological realm and certainly to the bodily realm itself when they begin to come inside of you? Like the New York Times reported this week they did some polling in the United States, and they described the new internets of the 21st century, who are young students like yourself. And this article said, and it was based on American college students, says that, you know, the most digitally equipped, net-graded and upgraded and cyber-connected portion of the population is really the student population itself. And they represent, as this writer said, they represent the tipping point generation. You represent the tipping point generation, tipping the future really into digitality. And he says really that generation has grown up that's deeply familiar with technology, sort of thinking either consciously or unconsciously thinking about technology itself, and is beginning to live in a space which is not the space that their parents began to live in. It began to live within the culture of cyberspace itself. So I was reading Michael Benedict, and I was thinking, oh, it's pretty interesting. You know, this, what Michael Benedict is talking about, welcome to cyberspace, really now has a generational expression. And I've spoken about before, you know, when people probably younger than yourself get to university, and they've spent their whole life in mental realms like mist. I really do think that the structure of knowledge in universities is going to sort of begin to shake, because there's going to be really different perceptual systems at work. So I sort of read that article on the one hand, then my eyes go over and I read another article which is about IKEA's new advertising campaign. Have you seen this new campaign? Well, IKEA's got a big problem. IKEA finds that it's stuck in sales. It's a question of technology and political economy. Its sales are beginning to stagnate, and that's because people are actually keeping IKEA items that they buy as furniture in their houses too long. And so IKEA is running a new series of ads playing in New York and other cities, and the ads are, it's called the disposability ads. And what they have is they show a lamp. It comes on, and they have a guy comes on, he says, you want to keep this lamp? Are you crazy? You should not be loyal to furniture. Furniture and lamps and things have no feelings at all. Junk it, throw it away, disposability, and then the ad slogan comes on the back, says, unboredom. Oh, well, this is pretty interesting. You know, kind of junk culture itself, trying to speed up to speed up the pace of circulation of consumer goods itself, and doing it all under the slogan of disposability, unboredom itself. And so you unbore yourself by constantly renewing yourself, not only put on a new kind of screensaver face, but you renew yourself by having new kind of furniture accoutrements. We get bored very quickly. So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about nihilism these days, and I know that for myself, that little advertisement is going to play some part in that. And what is their prospects for the culture itself? So I just wanted to give those examples of these different articles, of Michael Benedict's article in the first place, Welcome to Cyberspace, and then such a contrasting perspective, Arturo Escobar's perspective on, you know, welcome to Siberia, you know, welcome to the real world of ideology and politics and power. And let's talk facts. Let's talk about how, you know, technology really influences us. So if we could just start first with Michael Benedict's Welcome to, you know, Cyberspace First Steps, which of course Escobar is going to say first steps are like first steps in infantilism or something of the sort. Really different perspectives. And before I begin, does anyone have any questions or comments on the articles? Hello? What were your, has everybody read the articles? Give me a clue, because then I can sort of know where to start with. Did you have a perspective on Michael Benedict's Cyberspace First Steps? Sort of liked his perspective, yes?
Well, it seems as though he was basically saying that everything our culture has been leading up to cyberspace. All facets of society have been leading to us achieving this thing called cyberspace.
Yeah.
But I think if he's looking back at things, if you take anything and say, well, everything humanity has done up to this point is leading to this, you can find proof of that. So it's kind of a very simplistic view that he's taken, and
Oh, that's interesting.
you can argue it. You could argue any other manner of things from what it is.
Yeah. So you think Benedict's perspective is too simplistic, because he's really going backwards and saying there's like a primal cause of things or a primal origin in things.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really nice. And what about the argument itself? The image of cyberspace that he had?
Again, simplistic. I'm not sure. I'm still undecided on whether it's good or bad.
You're not gonna commit yourself. Okay. No, that's good. That's very temperate. Anybody else? Everyone's looking down, so let me go. Let me go and just say a very few things. And it's really true that Michael Benedict, as you pointed out really well, is doing exactly this. Michael Benedict is making like this kind of first cause argument. And he goes back into what he calls the realms, not of anthropology, but of human mythology. And he tries to give it a physical basis by saying going back inside the reptilian brain itself. So when I read the article, what I thought of Benedict's perspective, I thought, well, Benedict is not writing like it's really not a rational argument. You know, it's not that type of argumentation, but it's more important than that. I thought really what Benedict is writing, and why I think a lot of people really find this article compelling, is that Benedict is writing a mythology. He's writing like a compelling kind of story, a meaning structure itself. And like any mythology, like the Christian story of after the fall, like the political stories of liberalism, like if you're, for those in political science, if you read your Hobbes' Leviathan, well, Hobbes' Leviathan is mythology as well. Jean-Jacques Rousseau tells mythologies, Marshall McLuhan, there's lots of myth makers around. And one of the myth makers is Michael Benedict. And Michael Benedict writes this myth about technology. And I think the reason it's important is that it's this myth which is really inspiring to a lot of people working in technology who don't just do it for a job, but do it, you know, really as delirious forms of passion itself, and find cyberspace like a real form of personal emancipation. Like a couple years ago, I gave this talk at TED City in Toronto. And you know, I gave a talk and some other people gave a talk. And the people who were really interesting though were the young CEOs who got up, like from Zero Knowledge in Montreal and stuff and other companies. And people had a really large gaming companies. And they got up and they gave confessions. And confessions, as I listened to 3 or 4 of these confessions about how they sort of bought into the myth of cyberspace, all were exactly the same. They said they were all juvenile delinquents, commonly. One, the guy from Zero Knowledge said, I believe, you know, the guy who's in game culture, said that his mother literally, he was like 12 or 13, and she said, look, I've had enough, and maybe you should think of leaving home. So he said, well, it's pretty young to leave home, you know, sort of ejection. He said he just had this kind of real dissonance within himself. The guy from Zero Knowledge said he was always the chubby guy, couldn't get along, he hated high school, hated everyone, and they all had the same experience. They turned on a computer screen, and it's almost like sort of like they came out of the ocean of life in some ways, and they stepped onto the shore of the computer screen, and every person said they turned on the computer screen, they began to do a little bit of coding, and suddenly they just found something deep inside themselves being spoken to in a really such a deeply compelling way. They found themselves like at home for the first time in their life and at peace, and found themselves sort of slipstreaming through the data arrays itself, and found the possibilities of connectivity, the possibilities of universal communication, the possibilities of just really interesting forms of creativity and the kind of gambles and the kind of risk-taking that you can do in cyberspace itself, just kind of compelling itself. And they said, you know, from the moment that we first turned on a screen, we've never left our screens. And for each one of them, of course, they then became very successful businessmen in the new economy, you know, developing really interesting things like Zero Knowledge, you know, developing technologies protecting privacy. Or what about the guy who just yesterday who left Microsoft to found his own company? He was one of the 3 or 4 original people at Microsoft. He joined Microsoft when Microsoft had 40 employees in 1980 and 81, and he was the technologist. And he had actually worked for Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. And he said he was a Hungarian immigrant to the United States, went to Stanford or Berkeley and developed a computer program for a little program called Bravo. And then he went down to Palo Alto to Xerox PARC's research center and developed this program. Then of course you get Gates is smart, so this guy has really got something, so hired him away. And little Bravo program became Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word then became Office and Excel and things like this. So the story is the same again and again, like a young generation that finds itself sort of, you know, a space of like really creative freedom within the screen itself. And if you go down like the coast of California, or you go into Cyber City, Montreal, or Toronto, or Vancouver, or really anywhere in the world itself, you find people like really deeply committed and, you know, passionately involved in cyberspace, like seduced within cyberspace itself, not for particularly monetary reasons or rational reasons, what seemed rational, but really involved passionately because cyberspace begins to speak to something which is creative and connects deeply with their personalities itself. And I'm not saying this well, but Michael Benedict says it better. He begins like that article by speaking of the mythology of cyberspace with these beautiful utopian visions. He says, what is cyberspace? He says it's a new universe, a parallel universe created and sustained by worlds, computers, and communication lines. It's an electrosphere. It's much like the French theologians, Teilhard de Chardin. Do you know his writings, Teilhard de Chardin? Teilhard de Chardin wrote before Marshall McLuhan wrote, came up with this beautiful concept of the noosphere. Like Marshall McLuhan came up with a notion. Marshall McLuhan said that what electronic technologies do for us is that they're not just about simple connectivity. They really create the possibilities for, in fact, the global city, what McLuhan would call the global village. And for McLuhan, the importance of the global village was not just, like a normal kind of community. He said technology is deeply religious, that when you have technologies of communication, you open up possibilities for universal communication, for universal sisterhood and universal brotherhood. And for when technologies are like this, they are like epiphanies in Christian mythology itself. Before him, the French theologian Teilhard de Chardin said, really, it's almost as if we have different dimensions of experience. We have a biological level of experience and a social and political level of experience, but there's another level of experience, call it religion if you will, or call it technology. It's what Teilhard de Chardin called a noosphere. A noosphere was like this group area where you could go into, slipstream into, where you begin to mingle your identities with other people. You join in the possibility of a universal community. Like, for example, this first web art that I showed between Yale and Stacey Hardy. Now that's like Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere. Because here you are, like it's sitting in Montreal, or Tim Murray down at Cornell with Mary Louise, who I work with. We put out a call for, say, hey, let's do something on digital terrorism and ethnic scapegoating. And then two young artists in South Africa read this within the same technology of communication. And they don't try to mimic anything, but they say, hey, look, I'm waking up today and just really drunk down, depressed. I can't stand being massaged by these images anymore. What's happened to Soweto? What's happened to the act of memory itself? And then they begin really to create a piece of art that begins to reflect their local history, but at the same time it reflects, and if you're receptive to it, a lot of other people's history, and it's sort of an act of resistance. So it's what, Michael Benedict would say, it's an electrosphere. It's a global sphere of communication, a possibility of kind of slipstreaming into it, where your body is sort of sitting in whatever local space you're sitting into, but your mind is sort of navigating someplace else. It becomes so customary now that you don't even think about it. Like the noosphere and the electrosphere is all down the streets of Montreal. Like, I walk down St. Catherine Street to class. A lot of people have cell phones, carrying on conversations. And so I say, wait, this is like McLuhan's electrosphere in some place. Bodies are walking down the streets, carrying you someplace, and they themselves are sort of coded in fashions and Montreal streets. But at the same time, where are the minds of people? Yesterday, I walked beside someone. She was talking loudly, so I couldn't help overhearing her. She was breaking up with someone on the phone, and at the same time would say, just a minute, and then she'd cut in and she would go flip beautifully from English to French, and then she'd carry on a business correspondence with someone else, business conversation, then flip off, and then completely a different register of voice. And I thought, well, this kind of electrosphere has just become very customary for us. We really are digitally literate, begin to swim in itself. Or, as Michael Benedict says, it can be accessed anywhere and any time, in any city, in any street corner, any beach. We're nomads, but we're connected. We're nomads, but we're connected. We're, like palm people in some ways. The tablet becomes a page, becomes a screen, becomes a world. It becomes a virtual world. Everywhere and nowhere, a place where nothing is forgotten and yet everything changes. It's a common mental geography. It's a consensual hallucination. And finally, its vast data banks that network the world, its connectivity is an extension of human touch and human feeling itself. And then Benedict says that while you have all of these celebratory ways of describing cyberspace, it's still too simple of a description. He says these descriptions, which are what I would say is an ideological perspective. I would say it's a perspective of technotopia. And in this class, we're going to talk about two different perspectives, like Michael Benedict's perspective ideologically or politically is what I would call a technotopian perspective. And a perspective like Arturo Escobar's is a techno-realist perspective. Two very different takes on the same story of technology itself. Benedict says that none of these really describes cyberspace. He says it's like Shangri-La. It's like mathematics. It's like every story ever told. It's a mental geography of some sort exists. It's a collective memory. What is happening now, though, is something different. What is happening now is that technocultures around the world are tapping into this ancient reptilian part of the human brain. This ancient reptilian part of the human brain. Meaning that we are on the cusp of a great civilizational shift, is the conclusion that Benedict is going to say. That we think we're living in the age of the individual, and Benedict will follow Marshall McLuhan and other thinkers and say, no, we are just really beginning to live in the age of the tribal. We're living in the age of new electronic tribes and new digital tribes and new music tribes. We think we're living in a very rational age. Forget it. We are really living, and where you really live is in the beginning of a new mythic age itself. We think we have like a private self. No way. The technology, when it becomes invisible, when it comes inside us very deeply, means in fact that we become techno selves, that we become data flesh, that we become almost walking websites, not selves themselves. We begin to stream rather than walk. We begin to swim in the electronosphere. And we don't even do it, for big reasons. Just begin to do it ubiquitously. Like those dorms down in Boston College where I taught, where everyone, because it was a wireless university, every student had access to, really the fastest T1, T3 connections, and they were using it absolutely compellingly and maddeningly for instant messaging, which was just the thing. I mean, instant messaging, like IM University sort of, great university. And so in class like this, I taught, I said, well, what's this about instant messaging? Is there such a thing as like instant, IM personalities? And what does this mean? So we just began sort of reflection on that itself. But in all of these cases, it's as if, through consumer products, we really begin to put on the skin of the new culture. We begin to put on the skin and wear the skin of the new electronic city itself. And then Benedict draws some conclusions from this. He said, really, and he goes back to another great writer, Karl Popper, and says that there's these three worlds. He said there's like a world of objects. The world of objects is like nature outside of ourselves and culture. And then there's a second world, which he calls the world of consciousness. He says it's our subjective world. It's dreams and memories. So world one and world two. But then he says cyberspace is not world one, because it's not just objects. And it's not just world two. It's not just our private dreams and consciousness. Cyberspace is really world three. And by world three, he means this. He says cyberspace is like a world of information that mediates world one and world two. And he said anthropologically, we've always had forms of representation. We've always had forms of representation that have brought together our private dreams and our private consciousness and, the objects of our culture, our public life itself. Sometimes they're self-organizing forms of behavior. He references like anthills, he says, are complex forms of organization, or traffic patterns. All these ways of organizing, these ways of representing the world to ourselves, are ways of probing the future and adapting to nature. What makes a culture and a society and a politics exactly that is that we don't stay as isolated individuals inside our private memories, nor do we simply live within public life. There's also like a social and mental and ideological realm, which is called representations, and we live within this. And if you walk down the streets of Montreal, just to give some examples of this, you can see these representations. Like the new architecture of, La Cité Électronique is a collective representation of a society to itself. of how the society is going to project it, how Montreal and Quebec will project itself into the future as like a probe of the new electronic future, or the business towers itself. Or what about the World Trade Center? That's World 3. The World Trade Center is 110 stories tall, and it was intended to be like a real powerful hegemonic symbol of American power, of the power of world capitalism itself. And the World Trade Center would have been chosen as a target precisely for that reason itself. You know, because if you collapse the World Trade Center, let me tell you, you've begin to crumble the icons in some ways. You've really destabilized power. It's not just a piece of architecture and, you know, tragic loss of human lives. It's also, in fact, you've really begun to topple the icons. And I suspect that's why there's such deep fury in the American mood these days. There's really such a need for a scapegoat, someone to strike out against, like someone's done us real harm and someone's got to pay for us. Now, what did someone do to us that was so harmful? Is it tragic loss of lives? And that's certainly true, but I would say over and beyond that in the public imagination is probably also the fact that these omnipotent symbols of power, the Pentagon and particularly the World Trade Center, which was profiled and given such a privileged image over and over again in CNN and all the media of the world, was in fact sort of toppled and crashed. Someone's got to pay for this, and they're going to pay for this. So I think these examples for myself are like examples of cyberspace as World 3 itself. And we always live within World 3. Look at this room, which is just, screamed, brimming with World 3 representations called screens. Because we don't live in a world just of, static architecture anymore, or collective buildings, or just public architecture buildings. Our World 3, the mental geography within which we live, is symbolic. It's screens. And every one of us live our lives really within screen culture. Television screens, and movie screens, computer screens, and plasma screens and whiteboards, like this can be transformed into this kind of great whiteboard itself. And it becomes so ubiquitous and so unself-conscious, like so much a part of like normal life, that we don't think of it. But Michael Benedict thinks of it, because Michael Benedict says that this symbolic world, which somehow hovers as a new mental geography between World 1, by which he means physical objects, around us and nature outside of ourselves, and World 2, which is our private dreams and private unconsciousness, this world that navigates between the two is what he calls cyberspace, a mental geography. And of course, the argument that he's going to make is that our mental geography has really radically changed. He says because cyberspace is not like other forms of cyberspace is not like other forms of symbols. It's not just a large 110-story building. It's not the new glass tower going up for La Cité Electronique on René Lévesque. That cyberspace is something which is ubiquitous. We are electronic nomads. We are members of like a new kind of tribe, whether we want to or not. You don't have to be romantic about cyberspace to be a cyborg. In fact, you don't even have to know anything about it to be a cyborg. Everybody in this room is a cyborg. Everybody in this room that, for example, uses an electronic card to do electronic banking has been interfaced into new technologies of moving data at very fast speeds. If you do classes like this on the internet, you basically have cybernetic consciousness, because it's that the medium itself begins to work you over and create new possibilities. Now, this dream that Michael Benedict has been repeated by a lot of other people. You can think of like Alvin Toffler, for example, who long before Benedict wrote this said there were these three worlds. There's an agricultural world, and then there's an industrial world, and then out of the industrial world will come the third wave, what he calls the third wave of information. Or it's like Nicholas Negroponte in a really best-selling book called Being Digital, in which Nicholas Negroponte said the great change of the late 20th and beginning of the 21st century is that there are two worlds now. There's like a material world, but then there's like this new kind of immaterial world where you begin to move atoms at the electronic speed itself, like a new world of cyberspace and of cyber culture. So the story and the myth that Benedict tells is that cyberspace is really occupies this kind of common mental geography. It's kind of an internal architecture for ourselves, but it's different than other things in two different respects. One, that the motivation that impels us to find cyberspace as such a coming at home, in fact, is very reptilian in the human brain itself, because it really draws out of us our impulses towards belonging to a tribe rather than simply being an individual. It draws out of ourselves that we would prefer to be mythic as opposed to simply rational itself. And I think, like, if I look at Myst, for example, like Myst is not like this rational game. When you play Myst, you find as a very poor player, I would say. But you find yourself, in a game, it's certainly rational, but the speed of perception and the fluidity of the movement, goes too fast for any kind of words to follow. Like when I asked my nephew, can you tell me what you're doing? And he looked at me like I'm crazy, because he says, well, no, it goes too slow. So, like it's the speed of thought and the speed of perception in the game is moving so fast. The words themselves are like this big kind of drag on the effect, on the big drag on playing the game itself. That you develop a kind of web as imagination, or an I am imagination, as opposed to being a self. So Benedict's argument is, in fact, that this myth is not alien to us, but the myth of cyberspace is a way of coming home to something that we have suppressed for many thousands of years. We are really returning to electronic tribal culture itself. And remember I told you, I gave the example last week of the experiments in the future of reading. And so I think the experiments in the future of reading were very much like Michael Benedict's world, particularly those light array tables where you had little children, just all congregate around the table screaming and really excited, and just love the fact that you could tilt the table and letters would roll down the table and disappear from view and then appear on the opposite side of the table, and you could begin to form like sentences if you began to learn how to navigate the table itself. And I was looking at that, I thought, well, this is like Michael Benedict's world. It's like sheer joy was on the face of the children. Or when the children were playing, the cool cat in San Francisco, you just saw like screams of ecstasy. The fact that, the book began to speak and you could actually play the book and the book would begin to play you. That you were in a different realm. And I thought, well, this is not industrial and it's not agriculture. It must be cyberspace. Or once I gave a talk I remember giving a talk in Madrid. And just that year, it really, cyberspace really had just really hit Spain in a big way. They had gone out of the labs and people were getting computers and stuff. And they brought in, they set up in the art place where I was speaking, the company brought in they were a virtual reality company. So they brought in their gear. And it was the Spanish way of doing it was really interesting because rather than just like some clunky headgear, they did give people headgear, but they gave them this kind of really beautiful kind of sports outfits, like sleeping bags to put on. And so you climbed in, and they had just for children. And so children climbed into it, and they get this beautiful headgear, and who sort of wouldn't like that? And they're suspended off the floor. And then when you're in there, when you're inside, you in fact are no longer, your senses are all shut down. You don't really know, you can't feel anything, and your arms are closed down. But what comes alive, in fact, is in fact that you're able to navigate with your hands and your eyes through cyberspace itself. And you really have a feeling of, in fact, being inside, I don't know how to describe it, being inside like the data networks, being inside the light arrays, being able to move at the speed of light. And like for myself, it was like a real fact as I sort of sat back from this enormous long lines of children waiting to get into cyberspace. I mean, incredible lines with adults excluded. And every time a young child would go in and they'd stay, 5 minutes, they let people in. And then when they come out, you just saw this look of complete ecstasy on faces themselves. And they were very young children. I thought, wow, this is really, it's sort of like a Christian confessional experience of the thought. And I thought, Spain's never going to be the same after this because a new generation of people is discovering something. And I thought, well, it's like, again, like, thinking back, and it's like Michael Benedict's world, that cyberspace is not just customary representations. Cyberspace is so compelling and charismatic because it takes people into quite a different space, and it's not an alien space. As Benedict says, it's a space of coming home itself. So that's why then the article goes on to say that there's these 4 threads that go through cyberspace. He said the first thread that goes through it is that the people who come home to it first are the young, a new digital generation who sort of throw off second wave thinking and first wave thinking and become third wave thinkers. They in fact begin to learn how to move through the capillaries of the system itself. They learn digital literacy. You know, digital literacy is the badge to multimedia, to flash aesthetics. And that, for myself, is a real fact of life. Like I've noticed in my own life this really interesting thing. Like I'm a writer, do political writing and theoretical analysis of technologies, and do a lot of publishing. Like not just my own books, but also have always worked on public collective projects of print journals and electronic journals of multimedia. And the thing is that I've always been sort of like alone with Mary Louise, because there are a few of us our age doing this. But the people we're always working with, it seems, are 17 years of age, sometimes younger than 17 years of age, who have incredible aesthetic abilities, but also high levels of digital literacy itself. And it just seems that there's such like a digital generational gap, which will be erased as people get older, between, in fact, like a generation that's older that wants to experiment with new forms of digital literacy and digital knowledge, and those, as Michael Benedict says, who are like the first kind of exponents, the first riders of the future who have real digital literacy and begin to live in like a world which is still physical, but a world which is also electronic itself. So the first thread then is this, what Benedict would say is the new digital generation itself. The second thread that Benedict talks about is that cyberspace not only offers speed and instantaneity and global reach, but it also moves viscerally. It opens the way into sort of impossible spaces. Like if you go up and look at Christina McPhee's website, 47 Reds, the thing that's interesting about it, it's impossible spaces. Like the animations are so beautiful because they mimic, and the music itself is such a beautiful and a kind of impossible kind of music, and takes you to spaces that you can't rationally figure out, how these were actually created. It begins to like warp space, just like any good music that you would listen to begins to warp time and begins to warp, what's possible to do with music. Like if you do like sampler music and you do like just phasal syncopation, time compression, displacement, speeding up sound, slowing it down, do heavy repetition drones and things like this, you create like sound structures that are not generally rationally knowable. They're what Benedict would say, they're impossible spaces. They are what he would say, they are in a kind of electronic haze that we create and that we travel through in order to find ourselves.